Okay, so we are going today start chapter 9, which is getting into the politics of this time period, 1800 to 1848. We're going to be seeing there is a shift in the political parties, and we're going to start the second party system and really focus on the presidency of Andrew Jackson. So let's look at this rise of popular politics and look here at this particular image. And this is showing a very patriotic celebration. You can see that they are honoring various political leaders in the background. You've got people celebrating, wearing their military uniforms, and they're playing music. But yet you have this young African-American boy who's running away. And so when we start talking about this idea of expanding democracy, we're expanding democracy for white Americans, white citizens, but we are not including African-Americans in that. So the abolitionist movement will start to really kind of begin those discussions and become more of a force as we get towards the mid 1800s. But here in this early period, it's not really having much of an impact just yet. So look at the expansion here of voting requirements. You've got in the time period on the left where we're looking at 1800, where you've got green, you had to have a property in order to be able to vote. And then as we get to 1830, all of that that's in pink is talking about just paying taxes. As more people are moving to the urban areas, as we begin to industrialize, people are living in cities, maybe in these tenement houses that don't necessarily own property. So this is part of that shift, the expanding democracy, the inclusion of more people in the decision-making process. And then the states that are shown in gold would have what's called universal white male suffrage. And so this is saying you don't have to necessarily own property. The amount of tax that you're paying doesn't necessarily qualify you to vote. It is simply being a white male citizen in the United States. And those states would give you automatically the right to vote. So bottom line, when we talk about Jacksonian democracy, we're looking at the expansion of who's participating in the government and in the voting efforts. So this man, Martin Van Buren, is going to play a role in political parties, and he starts what we call political machines, where you have actual organizations that work through a very organized process to expand certain candidates in their popularity. So he changes the art of campaigning. And I would make sure that I'm familiar with Martin Van Buren. He really does link up with Andrew Jackson, who is the war hero from the War of 1812. And Martin Van Buren is the planner behind the campaigning that's going to really promote his candidates. So he's known as the little magician, that he's able to turn his magic to gain votes. The spoils system is another important concept that is linked to Martin Van Buren. And the spoils system is where you are rewarding people who were instrumental in getting a certain candidate elected. They get rewarded with a job in the government. And sometimes it's called patronage. Sometimes it's called the spoils system. It is the idea of trying to get your campaign supported by others and then rewarding them for that. So just remember those words, patronage and the spoils system, because that's also going to be tied with Andrew Jackson. He is going to be one of the first presidents who uses that system significantly to reward those folks who have gotten him elected as president later on. Okay, one other concept when we're talking about gender roles here, women are not necessarily gaining rights when we're talking about the democratization of the United States, the expansion of participation in the government, that's expanding within the male realm. But women are still with these spheres of influence where the domestic area is where they are responsible for contributing in the family and in their homes. And then one other key concept here related to the role of women during the 19th century, in the late 18th century, would be the idea of Republican motherhood. And one of the really important contributions that women will make to the United States society in the minds of people at this time period was to raise very committed young boys to become civic leaders in the future. That their responsibility, the women's role is to make sure that the ideas of the American Revolution and the idea of the Republican form of government and its value is passed on to the next generation so that they value that, and then will also take effort in protecting that in the future. So that's up to women. Even though women don't necessarily get to participate in the government, it's their responsibility to train the next generation to value this same system. Okay, we also need to look at the slavery issues. We know that slavery has extended from the colonial period when slavery was first introduced in the American colonies back in the 1600s, initially starting when the first Africans were brought to the shores of the Virginia colony in 1619, initially as a type of indentured servant. But again, did they really have much choice in the matter to come here? No. So you've got this idea of enslaved Africans who have come to the colonies. And then as the new nation is born out of the American Revolution and the Constitution, slavery is maintained. And we've talked about how even though slavery is not specifically discussed in the Constitution, that the framework of the Constitution protects it with the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Fugitive Clause, and then also the protection of the slave trade. Well, that slave trade comes to an end here in 1808 because it had been protected in the writing of the Constitution for that specified period of time. But 1808, there's no longer any national protection of the international slave trade. And so that does indeed come to an end. Congress does abolish the international slave trade, but that does nothing to end slavery within the United States. There just will not be any more legal importation of enslaved persons from Africa. But we saw before where there's going to be a shift with this reduction in the number of slaves coming in to the United States. It makes the slaves already here more valuable to that cotton complex in the South. And that's why you see states such as Virginia and Maryland and Delaware in the North that begin to sell their slaves for high prices to those to people in the Deep South who were looking for that enslaved labor for their cotton crops. It will not be until 1865 and the 13th Amendment that slavery indeed ends. But the discussion is going to pick up here in the early 1800s with the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, the international slave trade. No longer are we going to have the Middle Passage and the triangular trade with slavery being part of that. The discussion is going to still pick up about let's take this a step further and go ahead and end slavery for good. And a new organization forms called the American Colonization Society. So this is the first of two large national organizations that will be promoting at least an idea of ending slavery in America. But the American Colonization Society really doesn't gain a whole lot of traction. What they were planning to do with this organization is create a new nation on the continent of Africa, and it would return free Blacks from the population back to Africa. So it's more of this back to Africa movement that's going to come up again in the 1920s with Marcus Garvey. But that was the initial idea. And then the hope was that it would expand and eventually end slavery. Here's the problem. The vast majority of enslaved people living in America at that time had never lived in Africa. Because when you look at the timing of the international slave trade and the peak of all of those slave ships coming into the American colonies, that generation is really no longer living. And so most of the enslaved people in the United States were not from Africa. So this was not a place that they wanted to go. They wanted to be free in the United States. So this doesn't gain a whole lot of popularity. And there was also some skepticism among the free Black community that this American Colonization Society was actually trying to remove them from the population so that they could not lead a movement to end slavery for everyone in the United States. But the location that the American Colonization Society develops is here, the country of Liberia, and it gets its name from the word liberty. coming from the American Colonization Society. It was the idea of freeing Africans into Liberia from the United States. And the capital of Liberia is the city of Monrovia, named after James Monroe, who was president at the time that the American Colonization Society was first formed. So this, again, starts this nationwide discussion about slavery and what to do. Well, it causes the southern states to dig their heels in that much more. It causes more people in the North to become active in the abolition system, as we'll see in the next few chapters. One problem that definitely crops up and exposes the issue of slavery very, very clearly is what to do about the acceptance of Missouri into the United States as a new state. And if we look at the map here and you count it up, so the green would be free states, orange would be slave states in 1820, which was the time that Missouri is applying to become a new state. They've met the population requirement. They have written a constitution, but as they're applying to become a state, that would wreck the balance. At this time, there were 11 slave states and there were 11 free states that were already accepted. So there is a balance between slave states and free states in the Senate. Now, remember, you've got the House of Representatives based on population, but you have the Senate that is equal representation for every state. So as the slavery issue becomes more intense, if either side were trying to pass a law to either abolish slavery or permanently protect it, the opposing side could make sure that that didn't happen because there is a balance in the Senate at the time. So there's this huge battle over what to do with Missouri applying to come in as a slave state, because that would give those slave states that much more power to permanently protect the institution of slavery that the northern states didn't approve of. So Henry Clay comes up with a compromise. So again, he's in the House of Representatives and he issues a plan that would not give the North or the South exactly what they wanted, but it was a compromise to at least manage the issue. It does not resolve the slavery issue, but it will manage this particular situation. So here are the provisions of the Missouri Compromise. Missouri, okay, here's the first part. Missouri comes in as a slave state. Maine over here, that has previously been part of Massachusetts. Maine was never its own state until now. We're going to take Maine and separate it from Massachusetts, and it will come in at the same time that Missouri comes in, and it will come in as a free state. So we've maintained the balance of slave states and free states in the Senate. And then if any future states are proposed, we're going to draw a line from the southern border of Missouri across the rest of the Louisiana Compromise territory, or the Louisiana Territory. And above that line, if any new states are created out of this territory, they will automatically be free states. And any states that are created from below this line, they will automatically come in as slave states. And when you look at the map, it looks like that the North really got a lot more of this potential territory. But the question is, would cotton actually have grown there anyway? The answer is no. So this was protecting the area that white slave owners might want to expand into to create new states. And this was mostly Indian territory. So they didn't really necessarily think that this was going to be largely populated by white Americans moving into the region. So for at least a brief period of time, Henry Clay has created this resolution that that stops the conflict between the northern states and the southern states, but it never really issues a statement on slavery. It doesn't permanently protect it. It doesn't permanently abolish it. It manages the situation for at least that brief period of time. All right, so 1824 rolls around, and we're still during this period of the era of good feelings, where we've really just got one political party, all Democratic Republicans. And we've got a crowded race for this election. And look what we have here. We have John Quincy Adams, who had been James Monroe's Secretary of State. And we know that that's kind of a really important job and often a stepping stone to the presidency. And we have Andrew Jackson, who is fresh off that win in the War of 1812 and highly popular among Americans from across the different regions. William Crawford, who is from Georgia, and Henry Clay, our good buddy there from Kentucky, is also running as well. And if we look at the popular vote, it's fairly evenly divided, but we've got Jackson that has a few more votes. He's got 153,000, and you've got John Quincy Adams, who has 108,000. So Jackson wins the popular vote. John Quincy Adams has most of the votes here in the North, which again, his father was John Adams, who was a Federalist, not a Democrat or Republican, but still this is someone who is from that region who would gain those votes. And then Jackson has more of a mix. He has support in the Mid-Atlantic and in the South and in the West, where Henry Clay is really only a regional candidate who's gaining support here in the West where he's from. And then William Crawford only is carrying his home state of Georgia and Virginia. But then look what happens in the Electoral College. So in the Electoral College, we don't have any of these candidates gaining 50%. That's the magic number. The Electoral College, you have to win half plus one, and neither one does. Jackson has more votes than John Quincy Adams, but he still only has 99. He doesn't have enough to win the presidency. So the Constitution tells us that when no one has a majority, then the House of Representatives will decide between the top three candidates. So that forces Clay out of the running. And remember, Henry Clay is the Speaker of the House in the House of Representatives. William Crawford has a massive stroke, and his health is going to prevent him from really being able to serve as president. So it comes down to Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. And Henry Clay is going to play a key role in this because, you know, they're kind of in a deadlock. They're not gaining any sort of agreement over who the new president's going to be when the House of Representatives is making their decision. But all of a sudden, Henry Clay comes out and throws his support for John Quincy Adams. And Adams is given the election based on the vote from the House of Representatives. And almost immediately, when John Quincy Adams becomes president of the United States, he appoints Henry Clay to be his new Secretary of State. Now, what do we know about the job of Secretary of State? It often leads to the presidency, and Henry Clay has grand aspirations to be president one day. And so he thinks that this is going to be kind of his stepping stone. And he accepts the job with John Quincy Adams and becomes the Secretary of State. Well, Andrew Jackson is furious. He's like, I had more popular votes. I had more votes in the Electoral College, but John Quincy Adams is going to be the president of the United States. Something's not right here. And all of a sudden, Henry Clay becomes this, gets this coveted job to be Secretary of State. Jackson claims that there was a corrupt bargain, that there was a behind the scenes deal, that did John Quincy Adams come to Henry Clay and say, if you give me your support, then I'll make you my Secretary of State. Was there a deal that was made between them? Jackson says, absolutely, there had to be, and it was corrupt. And he's going to spend the next 4 years absolutely hammering and destroying John Quincy Adams' presidency and challenging the reputation of Henry Clay. Now, there is no concrete evidence that there was truly an arrangement between Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. But by the same token, there is also no conclusive evidence that there wasn't a deal between them. So we don't really know what happened behind the scenes, but bottom line, John Quincy Adams becomes president, Henry Clay becomes the Secretary of State, and Andrew Jackson is furious and is going to take them on. So as the new administration moves forward, Henry Clay is going to get some of his policies enacted. And in particular, that would be the American system. And I would really, really, really emphasize this in your notes that yet again, here's another major contribution by Henry Clay. Under the American system, he's going to really work on the economics of the United States, which is kind of curious for a Secretary of State to be so involved in this aspect of the government, but Henry Clay's been really working towards this for a while. So under the American system, that does pass. The federal government is going to create a protective tariff. We know what that means. It makes foreign products more expensive, American-made products are going to then sell more easily because of the tariff tax that's added to imported goods. So it's protecting manufacturing and using that tariff money to bring money into the government. That money coming into the government is then going to go back out through what Henry Clay calls internal improvements. He wants to really emphasize and redevelop the market revolution. We've got to make sure that canals are built and railroads are built and roads are built that are going to move the materials from one region to the other. And that tariff money is going to help pay for that. So internal improvements to the infrastructure of the United States will be paid for by the federal government, not the states themselves. And then he's also going to bring back the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States had expired under James Madison's presidency, and it was, under James Monroe's presidency, and it was not renewed again for 5 more years. So it expired under Madison's presidency, but then the second Bank of the United States was created, and it's also going to have a brief period of time that it is enacted for 20 years. So this National Bank of the United States is going to be put back into place. So if I look at this list of items, doesn't this really fit more with the Federalist Party? So this is Henry Clay, who's a Democratic Republican, working with John Quincy Adams, a Democratic Republican. But these are policies that really align with the old Federalist Party that had collapsed after the War of 1812. So Clay's getting a lot of criticism from within his party, especially coming from Andrew Jackson. So, and the people of the South. And in the South, they begin to refer to that new tariff as the tariff of abominations. Something that's an abomination is something that's bad, that's hated. So the North thinks that this is a good tariff, a good plan for them. So you've got the Northern perspective where the foreign products are going to be more expensive to protect the new American-made products. So this benefits the North. But here's how the tariff hurts the South. So they say if foreign-made products are more expensive, then the foreign countries are going to retaliate, and they're not going to buy as many American-made products. They're going to put a tariff on them. It's like a retaliation tariff that they're now going to tax American goods coming in. Well, the biggest export that we have in the United States is cotton, and it's coming from the South. And so this is going to hurt American sales of cotton. So this is something that they say is unfair to one half of the country. So as a result, that era of good feelings where we just had political unity and all of the Democratic Republicans were harmonious in one party, well, that ends. So we have a split within the Democratic Republican Party. And what we end up with is Andrew Jackson on one side saying, I don't agree with this. You've gotten so far away from the original ideas of the party of Jefferson. I'm going to form my own party. We're going to become the Democratic Party. Think about what democratic means. Democracy, people are involved, expanding who's involved in voting and not just an exclusive aristocratic class. So the Democrats under Andrew Jackson's leadership are going to believe in state power over federal power. They're going to believe in more participation in government, Jacksonian democracy, as we call it, and protecting the issues of the common man. And it's also going to kind of lean towards this more agricultural region of the South. Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams are going to still be in this Democratic Republican Party, but they're more of a nationalist Republican. So it's still the Democratic Republicans. Jackson's the one that's broken away. But look at the shift in its beliefs. It's believing now in a stronger national government. It believes in the tariff and the internal improvements and the taxes and all of this, and that the upper aristocratic class is better suited for government office. So this is a huge departure from what we have seen previously. So as a result, we've got far more people running or voting in the election with the expansion, the democratization of the United States. Who's able to participate in voting, right? A lot of those property requirements have been taken away. You bring back in more voters. So where this was our situation in 1824, look what happens here in 1828. And it is, it's quite significant here. where Jackson comes in as the new president. And this was a nasty, nasty election. So again, he's going after John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay with what he claims is the corrupt bargain. There are Republican newspapers that form that begin to try to stir up scandals related to Andrew Jackson. One in particular that they stir up relates to Andrew Jackson and his wife, Rachel. And Andrew Jackson, he may be this, really tough military officer, but he is completely devoted to his wife, Rachel. But the problem was when Andrew Jackson was living out in kind of this Western frontier area that was not yet a state, he was living in a boarding house where he met Rachel. And Rachel had been married before to this just deadbeat guy who was an alcoholic, and he ran out on her, and she never really heard from him again. So she had moved back home and was living at home, and the home where she was living with her family was the boarding house where Andrew Jackson was staying. So that's where they ended up meeting. And they fell madly in love, but she was technically still married, but they were living out in this area that was not yet a state. So the issue of laws protecting her were kind of uncertain. And they didn't even know where the guy was who she had been married to. He'd been gone for years and years and years. So the idea of tracking him down and getting a formal divorce really wasn't possible. So Andrew Jackson and Rachel, they do run away and they do end up getting married. But this all gets stirred up during the election. And so they start claiming that Rachel was this unpure woman and that Andrew Jackson was an adulterer because he was, or a bigamist because now he's married to a woman who's also married to another man at the same time. I mean, it was just horrible that they drug Rachel into this. And she was just, completely distraught that her reputation is being exposed all in public like this. She ends up having a massive heart attack and she dies right during the election time. And Andrew Jackson blames Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams for the death of his beloved Rachel, and he never forgives them. So they are bitter enemies continuing forward. So Jackson ends up winning the election, and you can see that he carries all of the South and the West. There's still some national Republican support here in New England for John Quincy Adams. Why would that be? Well, think about the American system. Who does the American system that John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay have promoted, who does that benefit? Well, it absolutely benefits those New England states and their manufacturing. So Jackson comes in after he has worked for 4 years to destroy John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay after what he claimed was the corrupt bargain in 1824. So Jackson comes in and takes the oath of office. And this was like no one had ever seen before. This is this rough and tumble guy from Tennessee. His nickname was Old Hickory. And so he shows up in the White House, and it is one gigantic keg party that takes place at the White House. There were windows that were broken out. There were people just everywhere. It was a drunken mess the night of his inauguration at the White House. So Jackson, and that's totally different from just the very, reserved Adams administration and straight-laced and all of that. And so here comes Jackson, and it's kind of shocking to everybody. So we refer to this time period as the age of Jackson because he is basically a whirlwind who comes in here in the political scene. And again, it's this idea of expanding democracy, getting the federal government out of the issues that are facing the United States and let the states handle it themselves. So Jackson comes in. His running mate had been John C. Calhoun. That's someone we've already talked about with the War Hawks in the War of 1812. And John C. Calhoun from South Carolina comes in, and Andrew Jackson, who is from Tennessee, so he believes that they've got kind of this Southern alliance going on here in the administration. Andrew Jackson also engages in the spoils system that we mentioned before, where Martin Van Buren has helped kind of guide this campaign. And so he rewards all of these folks who had helped him to get elected. Look at this cartoon. This one comes up quite a bit, and it's the patronage, which is also the spoils system. But look what it says: to the victors belong the spoils. And so you've kind of got these people that are riding in on the backs of this assistance from Andrew Jackson. It doesn't mean they're qualified for the jobs that they're getting. They're simply getting it for their loyalty. And so this is dangerous, where you're getting people in the administration, you're getting people in government jobs simply because of their loyalty, not because of their skill. And that's dangerous. And we'll see the problems that come about as a result of that later on. So very quickly, think back to that American system. One of the big issues that the South had was the tariff of abominations. So John C. Calhoun thinks, hallelujah, I've got a friend here in the White House. Jackson's going to strike down this tariff and it's all going to be a done deal. So look at and this results in a very heated argument and debate between John C. Calhoun and Andrew Jackson, and Calhoun ends up quitting. But Calhoun is asking Jackson to get rid of the tariff because it's hurting the South. And Jackson says, no, it's a federal law. I can't just strike down a federal law for no reason. So Calhoun says, well, fine. In our state, we're going to nullify this tariff. So think back. How is this similar to something that we've already talked about before? The state of South Carolina is going to attempt to nullify the tariff, which is a law that's been passed by the federal government during the American system of John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. And he says that if his state is not allowed to implement the nullification order of the tariff, then South Carolina is going to secede. There's that word again, secede, break away, form their own nation. They believe that in South Carolina, there is so much international demand for their cotton that they could survive on their own, and that the other states would follow with them and they would just form their own nation. That's a preview of things to come. But here's John C. Calhoun claiming that this is what action he's going to take. Jackson is furious. All right, now you would think, because Jackson hated the American system, that's why he ran for president, or part of the reason. So you would think that he would be supportive of John C. Calhoun. But this is where Jackson draws the line. If the state nullifies a federal law, then the federal government loses all of its authority. If South Carolina secedes, then the country is breaking apart on Jackson's watch. And this is where Jackson says, not happening while I'm president. I will draw the line and I will stop you from breaking up this country. So Andrew Jackson threatens to go after and kill John C. Calhoun. And he threatens to bring in the military, of which he's the commander in chief, by the way, to South Carolina and enforce it's called the force bill, that they would force South Carolina to enforce the tariff. Now, does Jackson really have the authority to do this on his own? Wouldn't that have to come from the legislature to authorize him to use the military force against the people of South Carolina? Probably would. But do you have any trouble envisioning Andrew Jackson using his military to go into South Carolina to make his point? Probably not. So Jackson and South Carolina, we're at a standstill between Jackson and the force bill that's authorizing him to use the military, and Jackson and the South Carolinians who are threatening to secede. Here comes Henry Clay again. So Henry Clay tries to put together a compromise which lowers the rate of the tariff, but doesn't do away with it. So it somewhat satisfies South Carolina, not really, but somewhat, and it protects the tariff that's still there. So this nullification crisis kind of collapses and subdues itself a little bit, but it's an indication that Jackson, even though he is very committed to his Democratic Party, is not going to allow the nation to collapse and split up into a separate country while he's president. So Calhoun quits. He goes back home to South Carolina. He's had enough of Andrew Jackson, doesn't like him. He's going to end up forming his own political party that we'll see in just a second. All right, so here's the ordinance of nullification that John C. Calhoun has proposed. So it's talking about, whereas the Congress of the United States passed this, we, therefore, the people of South Carolina in the convention here are going to nullify the federal law. So think about how this compares to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in Marbury versus Madison. Wouldn't this nullification ordinance be very similar to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, where they were trying to nullify the Alien and Sedition Acts? So these were the states trying to take that power for themselves. Where was the power at the time of South Carolina's nullification crisis? Well, Marbury versus Madison had reclaimed that for the federal government, where they are reviewing the laws to determine whether or not they're constitutional. So in this nullification crisis, South Carolina is trying to bring that power back to the state. It did not work. So Jackson, with force, or the threat of force, he never actually brings the military in. That's a key there. He never actually uses the military against South Carolina, but he threatens to. And South Carolina backs down when Henry Clay comes up with that compromise. Okay, so the bank war is another big issue that Jackson is going to be dealing with during his presidency. And Jackson's also going to be known for using his power of veto on a lot of bills that come through the Congress. Remember, Henry Clay, still Speaker of the House in the legislature, he's going to be bringing all of these pieces of legislation through, and Jackson's just going to veto what's coming in. And he's really the first president to use that on large scale. And people are like, oh my gosh, he's kind of like taking power away from the legislative branch and using it for himself with this power to veto. So think about that here in just a few minutes. So with this bank war, Jackson is trying to just beat down all of these separate issues that keep coming up one after the other while he's president. And so this is a pretty famous cartoon, General Jackson slaying the many-headed monster. So this is all of these different issues that are coming up, and he's just trying to keep control of it. So in 1832, Jackson and Henry Clay are running for president again. And so this is where we've got the Jacksonian Democrats, we've got the National Republicans who are coming in under Clay. So they're still calling themselves Democratic Republicans, but it's still kind of this nationalist brand, as we know. And then look at South Carolina, right? So they're not going to vote for Jackson because they're angry over nullification. So they have their own party that has been formed. And then you have the anti-Masonic party, which is kind of this really narrow little faction that is worried about the secret organization of the Freemasons that they think is dangerous. All right, so Jackson wins pretty convincingly here in the Electoral College. And this time around, since John C. Calhoun had quit, he is going to have a new vice president, and look who it is, Martin Van Buren, who had helped him campaign before. So Jackson and Van Buren come in into office for a second term. And this is when the bank comes up or will be coming up for renewal. And this starts a war between Jackson and his supporters and the Nationalist Republicans and the Bank of the United States. So Jackson or Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, who are national Republicans, they decide that they want to force the hand of Andrew Jackson before he is coming up for election in 1832. So let's go back and look at this. So in 1832, he's coming up for election. And Andrew Jackson is known to not like the Bank of the United States. So what Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, who's one of his leaning, nationalist leaning Democratic Republicans, believe is if they can force Andrew Jackson to veto the bank, you know, the charter had another year or so left, but let's bring it up early and force Andrew Jackson's hand. You know, if he keeps vetoing all of this stuff, it's going to make him look like a monarch or a king. So it would make him look bad. Well, it backfires because they override his veto, becomes the Bank of the United States is renewed anyway. Jackson wins the election, Clay loses again. So here you've got a problem because Jackson hates the bank and he's like, we can still manage this. You know, it became a bank anyway over my veto, but I'm going to withdraw all the cash from the bank. Just think about that. A bank with no money, it can't operate. And so he's saying, as part of the executive branch, I have the Secretary of the Treasury who is responsible for the circulation of money. So if the Congress creates the actual bank, my executive branch is responsible for the cash that is circulating in the nation. So we're going to withdraw all the gold and silver out of the Bank of the United States, and we're going to put it in the state banks that had been created, as we talked about before, between the first bank and the second Bank of the United States. And we're going to pick out certain banks, and we're going to deposit this gold and silver in those state banks. They become known as pet banks, like they were his favorite, his pets. So the first Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, when Andrew Jackson brought up this idea, was like, have you lost your mind? No, I am not doing that. That is a terrible idea for the economy. And so Jackson's like, all right, you're fired. So then the next guy who comes in says, terrible idea, not going to do it. So Jackson fires him. And then this guy, Roger Taney, says, I'll take the money out of the bank, no problem. So he becomes Jackson's new Secretary of the Treasury. The president of the Bank of the United States was Nicholas Biddle. So it's this big rivalry between Nicholas Biddle and Andrew Jackson over the money in the bank. And Roger Taney comes in and he's like, yeah, sure, I'll take the money out. I get to be Secretary of State. Great idea. So he removes all the money from the bank and the bank collapses. Well, it's now distributed among all these state banks that are all competing. You've got the economy that it's going to take a little bit of time for this impact to be felt. All right. So here he is. The bank has been crushed by Andrew Jackson, and you've got all of these problems that are going to be coming out as a result. One of the other major issues during Jackson's administration is the Indian Removal Act in Georgia. So the Cherokee Nation in Georgia happened to occupy most of our territory here where we're living right now, all the way north into North Carolina. And suddenly gold was discovered in Dahlonega, Georgia, right in the heart of Cherokee Indian territory. So the whites in Georgia wanted that land because clearly it's valuable, the gold is there, and they want the natives out. And so the state of Georgia passes this law that is going to force the natives out. Well, it becomes this controversy, and the Indians sue to try to keep their land, and then they don't get any sort of traction because they're saying that as an Indian nation, they don't have the right to have access to the court system. So that case is thrown out. And the Indian removal, they refuse to go. And it is a standoff between the state of Georgia and the government of the Cherokee Nation. So this is the chief of the Cherokee Nation. His name is John Ross. And then within the tribe, and he is a Native American, he is an Indian chief there of the Cherokee Nation. And there's another leader within the Cherokee tribe here in Georgia he's Major Ridge. He was a military man or whatever. And they end up disagreeing on what's going to happen. They've looked at everything that has gone on with the treatment of the United States with Native Americans. And in every single instance, the natives have lost their land. And so Major Ridge and what's called the Ridge faction work out a deal with the state of Georgia. And they're going to be compensated $5 million for their land. So the way that the Ridge faction, Major Ridge and his followers are looking at this within the tribe, and they're kind of a small group, the way they look at it is they're going to lose their land no matter what, so we may as well get some cash out of the deal. So they negotiate what is called the Treaty of New Echota. And Major Ridge, his son John, and then this guy Elias Boudinot are going to negotiate this. Well, John Ross and the actual leadership within the tribe were not consulted at any point when the treaty was negotiated. So they say it's not valid. It wasn't really with the government of the Cherokee Nation. So they refuse to go. You've got a disagreement within the tribe itself. You've got the people who are refusing to leave, and the Indian Removal Act is going to be passed. So this is the 1830 Indian Removal Act is supposed to secure all of this land in northern Georgia and in eastern Alabama. Well, there's another lawsuit. This time there's a missionary who's living in and among the Cherokee Nation. And you may have been to their, New Echota is actually the capital of the Cherokee Nation, and it's just above Cartersville. So if you go up I-75, New Echota is right there. And that's where Sequoia, you know, with the alphabet, and they have the newspaper and they have all their government buildings and all this kind of stuff. They're near New Echota. So it's an interesting place to go and visit. Well, there was a missionary who was living in and among the Cherokee tribe at New Echota, and he will represent the Cherokee tribe to sue the state of Georgia for keeping the land. So that's where we get the case Worcester versus Georgia. So this is the second case that's come up. And this one is an American citizen who is suing the state of Georgia. Well, the case winds its way through the Supreme Court, and John Marshall, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, issues the opinion. And the opinion says in Worcester versus Georgia that because the Cherokee Nation is a nation, the state of Georgia can't work out its own treaty with another nation. That is under the power of the federal government, right? So the federal government has to negotiate with foreign entities, which would include an Indian nation. So he's saying that the Treaty of New Echota and the Indian Removal Act is illegal because they can't do that as an individual state. So he actually rules in favor of the Indians. Well, Andrew Jackson steps in and says, fine. So John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Basically saying, you may have made this ruling, but do you have anything to back it up, John Marshall? Do you have a military at your disposal? Do you have any way to protect the Indian nation? And the answer is no. And Andrew Jackson and then Martin Van Buren, who comes after him, Martin Van Buren's actually going to carry it out, will order the removal of Indians from the state of Georgia, which begins the Trail of Tears, which I know that you spent a lot of time on in 8th grade Georgia history. So this is kind of the timing of it. And it's this power struggle between the branches of the government and states versus the federal government. So it's kind of both all rolled into one. So when we get into this expansion of democracy, we will see that there are different approaches to how you should handle the economy, right? So Andrew Jackson believes that the government should really stay out of it, that it would be best run or best suited as functioning on its own. And we're going to call this a laissez-faire economy. Laissez-faire meaning hands off or leave it alone. It's where the government stays out, that the consumers and the production is all determined by the individuals. The opposite of that would be a command economy, where the government determines what's produced, when it's produced, and how it's produced, and the prices. So you've got two extremes here. And the democratic ideals of Andrew Jackson and the Jacksonian democracy is leaning the economy. So we've already been talking about politics. Now we're leaning the economy more towards this laissez-faire side, where the government is out of those production ideas. So it is what we call classical liberalism, where there's less government involvement. So moving into this next section is where we get this eruption in party politics. So elections are rolling around. We know that Jackson has really used a heavy hand while he's president. So this political cartoon has been used a lot for SAQs and multiple choice questions. And it's referencing Andrew Jackson, King Andrew I. He's acting like a king. He's vetoing all of these bills and policies, right? He's vetoing the bank. They overrule the bank, but he's also just trampling on the Constitution and all of these policies here. So that's kind of the imagery that they're making. So this cartoon would be from the point of view of someone who disapproves of Jackson's handling of the government, that he's acting too much like a king in this. So out of this, we get a new political party, because Jackson is like, you Democrat or Republicans under Henry Clay, you are not a Democrat or Republican. You are not of the party of Jefferson. And so finally, Henry Clay and his cohort companion here, Daniel Webster, who is supportive of his nationalist ideas, say, okay, fine. We won't call ourselves Democrat or Republicans anymore. They become known as the Whig Party. So this is the second party system. Think about what's happened. We had the first party system, which is the Federalist and the Democratic Republicans. Then we lost the Federalist Party because of the War of 1812, and we ended up with one party, the Democratic Republicans. Now the Democratic Republicans have split into the second party system, which will be Democrat and Whig. But look at the ideas: state power over federal power, strict construction of the Constitution versus loose construction, laissez-faire economy, government stays out of it, more government involvement, protective tariff, national bank, internal improvements, yes, 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 no, no, no. Then we've got public education, government stay out of it, leave it to the states. Then we've got this idea of the common man. Yes, protect the common man. No, we need to have more educated people making government decisions. And then if we were to look at, okay, what does this sound like from the first party system? This group, the Democrats, absolutely in line, step for step, with the previous Democratic Republican Party of Jefferson. This group, completely in line with Hamilton's Federalist Party, the original first party system. So we may have two new parties, but the ideas have not changed. And that's really important here to think about, is that the ideas are consistent. All right, so then we get into the Whig Party ends up splitting because, again, John C. Calhoun hates Andrew Jackson because of the Tariff of Abominations. So by default, he was still part of this the Whig Party, the new Whig Party. But he's like, their ideas still hurt my home state of South Carolina. So the Whig Party ends up becoming regional. You're going to have Northern Whigs and you're going to have Southern Whigs that will vote a little bit separately. Okay, so this is going to once again be over these issues of regional issues, or sectionalism, as we will begin to call it. And then this small little group, the anti-Masons, are going to be absorbed by those Northern Whigs. All right, so look at the election here in 1836. The Whigs aren't going to run Henry Clay again, bless his heart. He wants to be president so bad. He's got this brand new party that he has formed, and he's like, yes, this is my chance. And they say, let's go with a war hero, because war heroes tend to do pretty well in elections. So Martin Van Buren, Jackson's going to step aside. He served 2 terms. He follows the precedent. Martin Van Buren is going to be the Democratic candidate, kind of carrying on this idea of Andrew Jackson. But the Whigs, instead of choosing Henry Clay, they choose William Henry Harrison. And you know, he was at the Battle of Tippecanoe, so they thought that that would kind of help him in the election. And then you've got the Whig Party. But again, notice we've got this independent here in South Carolina, because they're like, these Northern Whigs really don't support us. The Southern Whigs have their own party. And then South Carolina is like, we're totally out of this. So it's kind of a mess. But Martin Van Buren wins the election and becomes president. But almost immediately after he takes office, the elections in 1836, remember that bank war where Jackson took all of the cash out of the bank? He finally found Roger Taney who would do that for him. That's hurting the economy overall. So by the time all of that spirals down, remember the boom and the bust economy? So by the time new businesses can't form, they've got a lack of demand for their products. They don't need as many workers. People don't buy any items, and it's this downward spiral of the economy. By the time that happens, Jackson's not president anymore. Van Buren is. And we have this panic of 1837. And as a result, all of the government taxes and everything have to be paid for with gold and silver. They're not going to extend any credit. They're not going to print any paper money anymore. And that makes less money in circulation. So there's no more money available to be able to distribute, and it hurts the overall economy. So we're just really in this nosedive. Well, who gets the blame for that in 1837? Who's president? Van Buren is. So Jackson, even though it's Jackson's policies that caused all of this trouble, it's Van Buren who pays the political price for it, because the economy collapses, and it's just devastating. This panic of 1837, when unemployment rises, there's no more cash available. The money supply contracts with the specie circular, specie meaning tangible money, gold and silver, that's specie. And so the Specie circular is this mandate that they have to pay all of this with gold and silver. You can't use paper money anymore. So credit's not available. You can't get a loan. Businesses collapse. Unemployment rises. Things are not good economically. So you can see that the Panic of 1837 is also causing a social collapse, where you've got vagrants who are around here. They're drunk. You've got all of these problems that are going on in society, and all of it's being blamed on the Van Buren and the Democratic Party. So election time rolls around again, and the Whigs are going to also again choose William Henry Harrison here in the election of 1840. And it's going to be the hard cider and log cabin campaign. So they're going to try to, really build up the idea that he's a common man, because isn't that one of the problems that the Whigs had in the South, was that it was too aristocratic. It was too much about helping the North. So William Henry Harrison, being a war hero, they're going to play up and they're going to say, he's from the frontier. He was in the Indiana Territory. He's like you and I. He's a commoner. And he's also, his running mate's going to be John Tyler, who is another solid military hero. So here's their campaign slogan: tip a canoe and Tyler too. Remember me, I was the Indian fighter. And then also remember that, that I'm a commoner with this hard cider and log cabin, right? The log cabin being very folksy. So look at the outcome. Very, very convincing victory here for the Whigs. So once again, Henry Clay's been blocked from being president of the United States. This was a sure thing. I mean, it almost didn't matter who the Whigs ran for president, because people were so angry over the economic system that they were going to vote for the Whig regardless of who it was. So here was Henry Clay's chance, and his party chose William Henry Harrison. So he was devastated that he doesn't get to be president of the United States. So William Henry Harrison takes the oath of office, and it's a bitterly cold day. It's pouring down rain, and he gives one of the longest inaugural speeches in history in the rain, and he catches pneumonia and he dies within like 30 days. So here's William Henry Harrison, this hard-fought victory for the Whig Party. He comes in and gets pneumonia and is dead within 30 days. And so now John Tyler is the new president of the United States. But what the Whigs didn't know when they had chosen him for the vice presidency, his beliefs and his attitudes towards policy actually lean a little bit more towards the Democratic side. He's claiming to be a Whig. He's a member of the Whig Party, but his ideas don't align with the Whigs. They actually align a little bit more with the Democrats. So we call him a Democrat in Whig clothing. He's disguising himself as a Whig. Now, he didn't necessarily do this in some sinister way. It just works out that way. And now that he's president of the United States, there's nothing that the Whigs can do about it. All right, so we're finished up now with chapter 9. I hope that you are understanding kind of this political division between the Democrats and the Whigs, and the Northern Whigs and the Southern Whigs, because it does get confusing. So we'll talk about it more in class. And until next time, keep reading and go make history.